Mara Voss had 21 days to save a lighthouse nobody wanted, and $43 to do it with. She was 22 years old, sitting on a bus with a duffel bag between her feet and a folded county notice in her jacket pocket, the paper already going soft at the creases from how many times she'd unfolded it. Notice of intent to condemn. It said, in the kind of flat government font that didn't care whether you had anywhere else to go. 21 days from the date of this letter. She'd read it so many times she could recite it in her sleep, and some nights lately she did. 6 months earlier, she hadn't even known the lighthouse existed. Her mother had died when Mara was 11, and after that, home had never really been home again. Just a house she lived in with a stepfather and 2 step-siblings who tolerated her the way you tolerate a leak in the roof, something you plan to deal with eventually. When she aged out of anyone's obligation to keep her, at 18, nobody had argued. She'd worked 2 jobs, slept on a friend's couch, then another friend's couch, and gotten good, too good, at packing her whole life into one bag in under 10 minutes. So when a lawyer's letter arrived saying that a man named Elias Reck, a name she barely recognized as her mother's estranged father, had left her a property on the Oregon coast, she'd almost thrown it away as a scam. It was her stepbrother who'd looked it up and laughed. A lighthouse. He'd said it like a punchline. Some falling down lighthouse nobody's lived in for 30 years. Congratulations, you got the family joke. Nobody else in the family had even asked to see the paperwork. As far as they were concerned, it was worthless, and worthless things weren't worth a phone call. But what none of them knew, what Mara herself didn't know yet, standing at the bus station with a duffel bag and a stranger's name in her chest, was that her grandfather hadn't left the lighthouse to her by accident, and he hadn't left it empty-handed. Have you ever been handed something everyone around you had already decided was garbage, and had some small, stubborn part of you refuse to believe them? That was Mara, that whole first week. If you're the kind of person who's ever had to build something out of what other people threw away, stick around, because this is one of those stories, and if you're new here, welcome. I tell stories like this every week, about people who start with almost nothing and end up with more than they ever expected. So settle in. The bus let her off at a gas station 40 minutes outside a town called Hollow Point, and from there she walked, because $43 didn't leave room for a cab. The air smelled like salt and diesel and wet pine. Gulls screamed somewhere she couldn't see. And when the tree line finally broke and she saw it, a white tower streaked grey with age, standing crooked straight against a sky the colour of a bruise, something in her chest went very quiet. It looked exactly like what everyone had told her it was. Abandoned, ruined, worthless. She almost turned around right there. She didn't, because there was nowhere left to turn around to. The keeper's house sat low beside the tower, its porch sagging on one side, like a shoulder that had given up holding itself straight. The door didn't lock, hadn't in years probably, and when she pushed it open, dust moved through the grey afternoon light like something breathing. Old newspapers curled on a kitchen table. A coat, moth-eaten, still hung by the door, as if someone had meant to come back for it. She spent that first hour just standing in the front room, arms wrapped around herself, doing the math on 21 days and $43 and one condemned building, and coming up with nothing that worked. It was the next morning, walking the base of the tower to see how bad the damage really was, that she found the first thing that didn't make sense. Scratched into the stone by the tower door, low, almost hidden by a patch of dead ivy, were initials that weren't her grandfather's. E.R. That could have been Elias Reck. But beside them, carved just as deep, were 2 more letters that meant nothing to her at all. M.V., her own initials, carved into stone that had to be older than she was. She stood there a long time before she made herself keep walking. By mid-afternoon, she'd met exactly one person, an older man in a faded flannel jacket, repairing a lobster trap outside a shed near the water, who watched her circle the lighthouse with an expression she couldn't read. When she introduced herself, he just said, "Rex's granddaughter," not quite a question, and went back to his trap. Then, almost to himself, like he hadn't meant to say it out loud, didn't think anybody was ever coming for that key. She asked him what key. He didn't answer. Just picked up his tools and walked off toward the dock, leaving her standing there with the wind pulling at her jacket, and one more question stacked on top of all the others she didn't have time left to answer. 21 days. $43. A stranger's initials carved next to her own. And somewhere in that crooked, condemned lighthouse, a key nobody would explain. Mara didn't sleep much that first night. The wind found every gap in the keeper's house. Under the door, around the window frames, through a crack in the chimney flue. And it moaned low and constant, like the building itself was complaining about being disturbed after 30 years alone. She lay on top of a dust-covered mattress in her coat, listening, running the number 21 over and over in her head until it stopped meaning anything. By morning, sunlight came through a window she hadn't noticed was clean. Someone, at some point, must have washed that one pane and never gotten to the rest, and it fell across the kitchen table in a long gold stripe. She sat in that stripe of light and ate the last granola bar from her bag and made herself a plan, because a plan was the only thing standing between her and panic. First, find out exactly what the county needed to stop the demolition. Second, figure out what the key meant, since the man from the dock clearly knew something he wasn't saying. Third, don't spend money she didn't have. The walk into Hollow Point took the better part of an hour. It wasn't much of a town, a general store, a diner with a hand-painted sign, a squat brick building that turned out to be the county annex office, and a scatter of houses climbing the hill above the harbor, like they'd been poured there and left to dry unevenly. She got looks the whole way in. Not unkind exactly, just the particular attention small towns give to anyone new, weighing and cataloging. The woman behind the counter at the annex office had a laminated nameplate that said Denise Pruitt, and the flat, unhurried patience of someone who had explained the same forms to 1,000 confused people. When Mara said she owned the wreck Lighthouse property, Denise's eyebrows went up. "You're the granddaughter?" Not a question. "News apparently traveled fast here. We tried reaching next of kin for months on that tax notice. Nobody ever called back." "Nobody told me it existed until 6 weeks ago," Mara said. Denise studied her for a second, not unfriendly, but assessing, the way you'd size up a horse before deciding whether to bet on it. Then pulled a folder from a drawer without being asked. Inside was the full paper trail. 3 years of unpaid property tax, structural violation notices going back further than that, and the county's final determination that without a claimed owner actively addressing the hazard status, the structure would be demolished and the land absorbed into a coastal buffer program. "You've got till the 21st, Denise said. "That's not me being difficult, that's just the calendar. To stop it, you need to file an intent to restore with a licensed inspection showing the structure's stabilizable, plus pay down the tax lien. Even the minimums," she checked a figure, "just under $6,000. Mara didn't laugh, but it was close. "I have $43. Something in Denise's face shifted, not quite softening, but recalculating. "Then I'd get moving," she said, not unkindly. 21 days goes fast when you've got nothing but time and no money, which, no offense, looks like where you're standing. It was the kind of blunt that should have felt like a slammed door. Instead, oddly, it felt like the first honest thing anyone in this town had said to her. Mara thanked her and left with the folder under her arm, already turning the number 6,000 over in her head, trying to find an angle that made it survivable. She was halfway back down the annex steps when a voice stopped her. "You get all the bad news, or just some of it." It was the man from the dock. Flannel jacket, salt-white stubble, hands that looked like they hadn't stopped working in 40 years. He introduced himself this time, brief and gruff, like it cost him something. Walt Ferris. Said he'd known her grandfather 30 years, back when Elias still kept the light running, before the Coast Guard automated the whole coast and put men like him out of a job they'd built their whole lives around. "He talk about me?" Mara asked. "My grandfather, before he—" "Not much," Walt said. Elias wasn't a man who talked about family. Talked about the light, though. Talked about that place like it owed him something, or he owed it something. Never was sure which. He looked past her, out toward the water, like he was deciding how much more to say. "He asked after you, once, years back. Didn't say much beyond your name, just that he had a granddaughter out there somewhere he'd never met. That landed somewhere Mara wasn't ready for. She hadn't let herself think about her grandfather as a person yet, just as a name on a legal document, a stranger who'd handed her a burning building with a fuse already lit. Hearing that he'd known her name, wondered about her, while her own family upstream had barely mentioned he existed, it cracked something open she didn't have time to feel right now. "The key," she said instead, because it was easier than the other thing. "Yesterday you said you didn't think anyone was ever coming for it. What key?" Walt's jaw worked like he was chewing on whether to answer. "Ask me again once you've been out there a few more days," he said. "Some things a person ought to find on their own." And before she could push further, he nodded once, like that settled it, and headed off down toward the boats, leaving her standing on the annex steps with a folder of bad news and one more piece of a puzzle she couldn't yet see the shape of. She walked back to the lighthouse with her mind circling two problems at once: $6,000 she didn't have, and a key nobody would explain. And it was almost dusk by the time she reached the property again, the tower throwing a long, crooked shadow across the grass. That was when she noticed the shed. It sat behind the keeper's house, half swallowed by blackberry bramble, its door hanging on one hinge. She hadn't even registered it existed the day before. There'd been too much else demanding her attention. Now, in the flattening evening light, she could see there was a padlock on it. Not old and rusted like everything else on the property. New. Recently oiled even. The metal catching the last of the sun with a dull gleam that didn't belong anywhere near 30 years of neglect. Someone had put a new lock on an old shed, and not long ago. She crossed the yard and crouched in front of it, running her thumb over the lock's shackle, cold and slightly damp. There was no keyhole she could pick with anything in her bag, no combination dial, nothing but smooth, deliberate metal, daring her to find whatever fit it. Behind her, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of the tide going out, and somewhere down the hill, a dog barked twice and went quiet. Mara stayed crouched there a long moment, staring at that lock, thinking about Walt's words, "Ask me again once you've been out there a few more days," and wondering exactly what her grandfather had wanted badly enough to protect it, 30 years after he'd stopped needing to protect anything at all. She didn't have a key. She didn't have $6,000. She had 20 days left, and now, apparently, a locked shed to add to the list. She spent a long time in the dark before she went inside, just looking at that padlock, feeling, for the first time since she'd stepped off the bus, not just afraid of what she'd have to lose, but curious, almost against her will, about what she might still find. The rain started sometime after midnight, and hadn't let up by morning. Mara woke to it, drumming on the tin roof of the keeper's house, a steady percussion that made the whole building feel like it was standing inside a drum. She lay there a while, watching a thin line of water trace its way down the wall above the window, and thought, 19 days now. Not that the number needed shrinking to feel any smaller. She made herself go out anyway, wrapped in her one good coat, and climbed the spiral stair inside the tower for the first time since arriving. It was worse than she'd braced for, and somehow also less. Worse, because two of the iron stair treads near the top gave under her weight with a groan that sent her heart into her throat and made her retreat 3 steps before continuing. Less, because when she finally reached the lamp room at the top, the glass, cracked in 2 panes but otherwise intact, still held enough of its shape that she could see clean across the water in every direction, grey and endless, whitecaps stacking up toward a horizon she couldn't find the seam of. There was something in that view that undid a little of the knot in her chest. For just a moment, standing up there in the wind that leaked in through the broken pane, she understood, abstractly, distantly, why a man might spend his whole life keeping a light burning out here for ships he'd never meet. The lamp mechanism itself was gone, stripped out decades ago when the Coast Guard automated the coast, leaving a rust-ringed platform where something important used to sit. But bolted to the wall beside it was a small built-in cabinet, warped shut with age, and when she worked her fingers into the seam and pulled, it came open with a shriek of old hinges to reveal nothing but a coil of rotted rope and a logbook, its cover soft with damp, most of its pages fused together beyond reading. Most of them, not all. On the one page she managed to peel free without tearing. In handwriting gone thin and slanted with age, she found a single legible line, "Told M today." She didn't believe me either. Nobody does until they see it themselves. She read it 4 times. Told M today. Not her. She hadn't been born yet when this book was written, judging by the water damage and the brittleness of the paper. Someone else. Another M. Another piece of a story that kept almost including her and never quite explaining itself. She carried the logbook down carefully, wrapped it in a plastic bag from her duffel to keep what was left of it dry, and set it on the kitchen table like evidence in a case she didn't yet understand the shape of. By mid-morning, the rain had thinned to a drizzle, and hunger, plain, practical hunger, unrelated to any mystery, sent her walking back into Hollow Point. $43 didn't stretch far, and she'd learned enough about herself in 4 years on her own to know that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford before food. The diner had a handwritten "Help Wanted" sign taped inside the window, half peeling at one corner. Mara stood outside it a full minute before she made herself go in. The woman behind the counter, 60-some, silver hair scraped back, a voice like gravel dragged over a comfortable amount of years, looked her over with the same assessing patience Denise had shown at the annex. Her name tag said, Bev. "You're the Lighthouse girl," Bev said, before Mara had said a word. Word traveled fast in a town this size. She was starting to understand that wasn't a figure of speech here. "Heard you were up there alone in that wreck. Heard the county's fixing to tear it down. Trying to stop that, actually," Mara said. "Which is part of why I'm here. Saw your sign." Bev studied her another moment, taking in, Mara suspected, the state of her coat, the exhaustion she couldn't quite hide, the particular stubbornness that had probably been written all over her face since the bus station, and then, without much ceremony, said, 6 a.m. starts. Cash under the table till I get around to doing the paperwork right, which, for the record, is a promise I make and mostly keep. You any good carrying 4 plates at once? I can learn. That's the right answer, Bev said. And just like that, Mara had a job. It wasn't much, a few dollars an hour plus whatever tips a half-empty coastal diner produced in the off-season. But it was something, a foothold, a small proof that the ground under her hadn't fully given way. She started the next morning before sunrise, and it was there, refilling a coffee cup for a table of retired fishermen, that she overheard the first thing that snagged her attention hard enough to nearly spill the pot. "Whitmore's tried buying that Lighthouse parcel off the county twice," one of the men was saying, low, not meant for her ears. "Both times, Rex's paperwork blocked it somehow. Never did figure out how a man with that little money kept out-lawyering a family with that much." "Don't matter now," the other one said. "Girl's got 20 days and no money at all. Whitmore's'll get it eventually. Just a matter of waiting." Mara kept pouring coffee, like she hadn't heard a word, but her hands weren't quite steady doing it. The Whitmores, a name that hadn't come up once, not from Walt, not from Denise, not from the county folder full of tax notices and violation reports. A family who'd apparently wanted this worthless, condemned lighthouse badly enough to try buying it twice, and had been blocked, somehow, by a man with almost nothing. She thought of the new padlock on the shed. She thought of "Told Em today, she didn't believe me either." She thought of her own initials carved into stone older than she was. None of it added up yet. All of it was starting to feel like it was circling the same center. She didn't get a chance to ask anyone about the Whitmores that day. Bev kept her running the whole shift, and by the time she trudged back up the coast road toward the lighthouse, the light was already failing, the sky gone the deep, bruised blue that came right before full dark. She was almost to the keeper's house when she noticed something different about the shed. The padlock was still there, still shut, but the bramble in front of the door, thick, undisturbed blackberry cane that had clearly grown wild and untouched for years, had been cut back. Not by her, not by wind or weather. Cut deliberately, close to the ground, in a rough half-circle that gave clear access to the door. Someone had been here, while she was gone, clearing a path to a locked shed she still didn't have the key for. She stood in the near dark with her pulse ticking up, scanning the tree line, the empty yard, the tower's black silhouette against the last of the light, and saw no one, heard nothing but the wind and the distant, endless work of the tide going out. Whoever it was, they hadn't taken anything. They hadn't broken the lock. They just wanted her to see that the path was clear. Mara didn't sleep well again that night, which was becoming less an exception than a pattern. She lay listening for footsteps that never came, replaying the sight of that cleared path to the shed door, until the shapes in the dark outside her window started to look like people who weren't actually there. By first light, she'd talked herself calm enough to think straight. Whoever had cut back that bramble hadn't broken in, hadn't taken anything, hadn't left a note or a threat. If anything, it read less like a warning and more like an invitation, though an invitation to what, and from whom, she still couldn't say. She went to work at the diner before sunrise, same as the morning before, and spent the whole shift turning two names over in her head like stones, Whitmore and whoever M was in that logbook entry, waterlogged and half-legible, up in the lamp room. During a lull between breakfast and lunch, she finally worked up the nerve to ask Bev directly. "You know a family called Whitmore?" Bev's hand stilled over the register for just a beat before she kept counting change. "Everybody around here knows the Whitmores. They own about a third of the coastline from here to Cedar Point." "Marinas. A couple of the newer developments up the hill. That fish processing plant that put half the old independent boats out of business 15 years back." She said it plainly, without much heat, the way you'd recite facts about weather. Why? Mara hesitated, then decided honesty was cheaper than pretending. "Heard some men in here saying they tried to buy my grandfather's property, twice, and got blocked somehow." That got Bev's full attention. She set down the roll of quarters she'd been counting and looked at Mara properly, like she was recalculating something. "That true? Didn't know that." A pause. "Wouldn't surprise me, though. Elias Reck was a stubborn old cuss, God rest him, but he wasn't stupid. If he found a way to keep that land out of Whitmore hands, he'd have done it just for the principle of the thing, whether or not there was a reason behind it." "You think there's a reason behind it?" Bev studied her a moment longer, then went back to counting quarters, which Mara was starting to recognize as this town's particular way of ending a conversation it wasn't ready to finish. "Ask Walt," she said. "He knew your grandfather better than anybody left breathing, and he's not near as tight-lipped as he lets on. Just takes patience." Patience was one of the only resources Mara had left in any real supply, so after her shift, she walked the half-mile down to the dock instead of straight back to the lighthouse, and found Walt exactly where she'd found him twice before, mending gear with the unhurried focus of a man who'd been doing the same motions since before she was born. "You again," he said, not unkindly, without looking up. "I heard the Whitmores tried to buy my grandfather's property, twice, and that he blocked it somehow, even though he barely had 2 dimes to his name." She sat down on an overturned crate near his workbench, uninvited, and decided to just wait him out the way Bev apparently would have. Walt's hands kept working the net for a long moment. Then he set it down. "There's a thing about this stretch of coast most folks who didn't grow up here don't know," he said. "Back before any of the development went in, before the Whitmores were the Whitmores, this land, the point the lighthouse sits on, and a good stretch behind it, wasn't going to the county or the Coast Guard when the light got automated. It was going up for private sale. Cheap, because nobody wanted a crumbling tower and a strip of cliffside nobody could build on without an act of God and a mountain of permits. So my grandfather bought it. Bought it before anyone else even knew it was on the market," Walt said, "which is the part that always struck me odd. Elias worked as a keeper here his whole career, made a keeper's wage his whole career, and somehow he had the cash in hand, quiet and quick, before word ever got round town that the land was even for sale. Whitmores were furious. Old man Whitmore, this fellow's grandfather, tried buying him out twice over the years that followed. Elias wouldn't sell for any price, wouldn't even discuss it. Why not, if he needed the money? That, Walt said, picking his net back up, like he'd decided he'd said enough for one sitting, is exactly the question I never got a straight answer to either. Elias used to say the land wasn't his to sell, not in the way most men mean that. Like it belonged to something bigger than just him owning a deed. Mara sat with that a moment, watching the grey water slap against the pilings, thinking about a padlock that gleamed too new against 30 years of rust, and a logbook page that mentioned a woman who wasn't her, but whose name started the same way hers did. "The key you mentioned," she said finally, "the one you said I wasn't ready to hear about yet, does it have something to do with the shed?" For the first time since she'd met him, something like real hesitation crossed Walt's face, not the guarded, close-mouthed kind he'd shown her before, but something closer to grief. "It has to do with a promise I made your grandfather," he said, "that I'd only tell his kin the whole of it once I was sure they meant to stay and fight for the place, not just sell it off the second the county backed down. Elias got burned once, trusting the wrong person with what he'd built out here. I won't be the second one to make that mistake. I don't have anywhere else to go," Mara said, quieter than she meant to. "I'm not looking to sell it. I couldn't even if I wanted to. Nobody sane would buy a condemned lighthouse with a county deadline hanging over it." Walt looked at her for a long moment, weighing that, and something in his face eased, just slightly. "Give it a few more days," he said. "Prove it, not just say it. Then come find me." And though it wasn't the answer she'd wanted, it felt, for the first time, less like a door shutting and more like one left slightly open. She walked back to the lighthouse as the light went gold and low across the water, turning everything, the grass, the tower, even the cracked porch steps, the same warm, forgiving color for a few minutes before dusk swallowed it. She was almost to the door when she noticed the shed again, out of habit now, checking it the way you'd check a wound to see if it was healing or getting worse. The padlock was gone, not broken, not forced, simply gone. The hasp hanging open and empty, the door itself cracked an inch, as if someone had unlocked it and walked away without bothering to close it fully behind them, or as if they'd wanted her to be the one to open it the rest of the way herself. Mara stood in the darkening yard a long moment, heart going hard and fast, one hand still on the strap of her bag, and found that underneath the fear, underneath 18 days and no money and a condemned building at her back, there was something else rising up to meet the moment. She wanted to know, badly enough that her feet were already moving toward the door before she'd fully decided to let them. The door gave way with a groan, swinging inward on the single hinge, and for a moment Mara just stood on the threshold, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the dark inside. The air that came out to meet her smelled of oil, sawdust, and something older underneath. The particular mustiness of things, left untouched by weather, but not by time. She found a lantern hanging just inside the door, an old oil lamp, the kind her grandfather would have used before anyone thought to run electricity this far out, and beside it, on a nail, a box of matches gone soft with damp but still, when she struck one, willing to catch. The light it threw was small and warm and shaking, and by it she saw the shed for what it actually was. Not a ruin like everything else on the property, but a workshop. Tools hung on the wall in careful rows, each one outlined in chalk on the wood behind it, so you'd know exactly where it belonged when you put it back. A workbench ran the length of one side, its surface scarred but swept clean. Someone had kept this space in working order long after the rest of the property had been let go. That someone, she understood with a small cold jolt, hadn't been her grandfather. Elias Reck had been dead 6 months. Dust didn't lie, and there wasn't nearly enough of it in here for 6 months of neglect. She moved deeper in, lantern held high, and found the workbench's lower cabinet secured with a simple hook latch, not locked at all, as if whatever needed protecting wasn't in the workshop itself, only accessible through it. Inside the cabinet, a battered metal toolbox, and beneath that, wrapped in a square of oiled canvas gone stiff with age, a small wooden chest, no bigger than a bread box, its corners reinforced with brass fittings gone dark and dull. This one was locked. A real lock, old-fashioned, the kind that wanted an actual key rather than a combination or a code. The kind of lock that made Walt's words from that afternoon land differently in her chest. The key you mentioned. She sat back on her heels in the lantern light and turned the little chest over in her hands, feeling the weight of something shifting inside it. Not coins, not exactly, more like paper. Layers of it, sliding faintly when she tilted it. Whatever was in there, it had been sealed away deliberately, by someone who'd meant for it to survive both time and easy discovery. There was a name burned into the underside of the lid, faint, the kind of mark made with a heated tool rather than ink. Not Elias, not Mara. Just 3 letters, MVR. She stared at them so long the lantern flame guttered before she noticed it was low on oil. MVR, her own initials, MV, Mara Voss, sat inside those 3 letters like they'd been built to fit there, with one more letter tacked on the end she didn't understand yet. R, for wreck, maybe. As if someone, a long time ago, had already been thinking about a version of her that didn't exist yet. A Voss, who might one day carry a wreck name too, or at least carry a wreck legacy, whether or not she ever knew to expect it. It was too much to sit with, alone, in a half-collapsed shed with a dying lantern. She wrapped the chest back in its canvas, careful as if it were something alive, and carried it into the keeper's house, setting it on the kitchen table beside the ruined logbook, like the two of them might explain each other if she just gave them enough time in the same room. She didn't sleep that night either, but for once, the reason wasn't dread. She sat at the table long after the lantern burned out, and the only light left was what the moon threw through the one clean window pane, running her thumb over the brass fittings, listening to the sea work against the rocks below the point, and let herself, for the first time since the bus station, feel something close to hope. Not certainty, not safety, just the thin, stubborn thread of it, the sense that she hadn't been left something worthless after all, whatever the county paperwork said, whatever her stepfamily had laughed about back home. In the morning, she went looking for Walt before her diner shift, found him already out on the water in his small boat checking pots, and stood at the end of the dock waving until he noticed her and rowed back in. Found the shed open, she said, before he could ask. Found a locked chest inside. Got my initials burned into the bottom of the lid. Not just mine, an extra letter on the end I can't make sense of. Walt went very still, one hand still resting on the boat's gunwale. MVR, he said, not a question. How did you know that? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. Then he reached into his jacket, into an inside pocket worn soft from years of use, and drew out a small brass key on a length of frayed cord, the metal gone dark with age, but clearly, obviously, cared for. Your grandfather gave me this the year before he died, Walt said. Told me to hold it till his kin came looking. Not for the property, mind. Anybody could inherit a deed. He meant till someone came looking for the truth of the place. Said I'd know it when I saw it. He turned the key over once in his weathered fingers before holding it out to her. Figured that was you, the second you sat down uninvited on my crate and wouldn't leave till I answered you straight. Mara took the key. It was warm from his pocket, lighter than she expected, and it fit her palm like it had been waiting there. What's in the chest? She asked. Wish I could tell you, Walt said, and for the first time since she'd met him, something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. Elias never let me look, said some things a person's only allowed to find out for themselves, in their own time, once they've proven they mean to stay. He nodded once toward the lighthouse, visible from here as a pale, crooked line against the grey morning sky. Looks to me like you've about proven it. She walked back to the keeper's house, with the key clenched tight enough in her fist that the metal left a mark on her palm. 17 days left on a county clock she still had no real way to beat. $6,000 she still didn't have, and, sitting on her kitchen table, a small wooden chest that had been waiting, apparently, for exactly her, for longer than she'd been alive to know it. She set the key against the lock with hands that weren't quite steady and turned it. The lock gave with a soft click, and Mara sat back on her heels, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the dock. Inside, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth, was money. More of it than she'd seen in one place in her whole life. Not loose bills stuffed carelessly, but bundled, banded, organized with the same careful precision as the tools hung on the shed wall. She counted it twice with shaking hands before she trusted the number enough to believe it. Just under $9,000, in bills old enough that some of them belonged to a design the Treasury hadn't printed in decades. Beneath the money, folded in a square of cloth gone soft as felt, was a letter. Her grandfather's handwriting, she recognized it now from the logbook, but steadier here, more deliberate, like it had been written slowly, with care, rather than jotted in the margins of a working life. To whoever finds this, and I have to believe, against every practical reason not to, that it will be you, Mara, whether you come as a girl grown or a woman already weathered by the world. I never got to know you. That is the great regret of my life, Greater than the light going automated, greater than losing your grandmother, greater than any of it. Your mother and I said things to each other we shouldn't have, and pride kept us both from unsaying them until it was too late for either of us to try. I am sorry for that. In a way, words were never built to carry properly. What I have left you is not much to look at. I know that. I knew it the day I bought it. Cheap, unwanted, a strip of rock the world had already decided wasn't worth keeping the light on for. But I want you to understand something before you spend a single dollar of what's in this chest. The money was never the gift. The money is just enough to buy you time to see what the gift actually is. The gift is this: a place that will still be standing after everything easier has been sold off or torn down. A place where the work is honest and the tide doesn't care what anyone back home ever said about you. I kept that light burning for 40 years for ships I never met, because someone has to be the one who doesn't give up on the thing nobody else believes is worth saving. I think you might be built the same way. I hope, more than I have hoped for anything, that you'll give this place, and yourself, the chance to prove it. Whatever you decide, know that you were thought of and wanted long before you ever knew it. Elias Mara read it 3 times through, and by the 3rd time her vision had gone blurry enough that she had to stop and press the heel of her hand against her eyes before she could keep going. She'd spent 4 years since her mother died believing, somewhere underneath everything, that she was a problem other people inherited and quietly wished they hadn't. And here was a man she'd never met, a stranger by every practical measure, who had spent decades thinking of her as someone worth waiting for. She sat at the kitchen table a long while, the money in one hand and the letter in the other, feeling the strange doubled weight of both, one that solved a problem measured in days and dollars, the other that solved something older and harder to put a number on. It was late morning by the time she made herself move, tucking the cash into an inside pocket and folding the letter with a care that bordered on reverence before she carried it all back down to the annex office. Denise looked up from her desk, and something in Mara's face must have told her the visit wasn't routine, because she set down her pen without being asked. "I can pay the lien," Mara said, and set the bundled cash on the counter between them. Denise's eyebrows climbed. She counted it, twice, the way people count money that surprises them, and then looked up. "This covers it. Full lien, plus the filing fee for the intent to restore." A pause. "You still need the licensed inspection to actually stop the demolition order. That structure's got real problems, not just paperwork ones, but this buys you the time to get it." "Where do I find an inspector out here?" "There's one in Cedar Point does county work, booked out most weeks, but I can put a rush note on it given your deadline." Denise was already reaching for a form. Then she paused, glancing at Mara over the top of her glasses. "Mind my asking where a girl with $43 found $9,000 in 3 days?" "My grandfather left it for me," Mara said. "Just took me a little while to find where." She walked out of the annex office, lighter than she'd walked in anywhere, in longer than she could remember. Not free of trouble, not by a long stretch, but for the first time since the bus station, standing on ground that felt like it might actually hold her weight. She didn't go straight back to the lighthouse. She went to the diner first, mostly because it was nearly her shift, and partly because she wanted, badly, to tell someone who'd understand what the letter had meant, not just what the money had bought. Bev took one look at her face over the counter and set down the coffee pot. "You found it," Bev said. "Not a question. Same as everyone else in this town seemed to ask things." "Found more than I expected," Mara said, and something about the way she said it must have carried enough weight that Bev didn't push for details, just nodded, like she understood there were some things a person needed to keep to themselves a while longer. It was near the end of her shift, wiping down the counter in the last slow hour before close, that she overheard the bell over the door and looked up to see a man she didn't recognize step inside. Expensive coat, entirely wrong for a fishing town, the kind of haircut that cost more than her whole outfit, and an expression that landed on her with an unpleasant, deliberate weight the second their eyes met. "You'd be Miss Voss," he said, before she'd said a word. "I understand congratulations are in order, settling the lien on the old wreck property." He smiled in a way that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "My family's had an interest in that land a long time. Thought it was time we finally introduced ourselves properly." Mara set down her rag and made herself meet his eyes, because 4 years of aging out of foster care and sleeping on other people's couches had taught her exactly one non-negotiable rule: never let a stranger see you flinch first. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. "I don't know your name." "Preston Whitmore." He said it like it should mean something, and in this town, apparently, it did. She caught the way Bev's hands stilled at the register, the way the two men at the corner booth suddenly found their coffee very interesting. "My grandfather knew yours." "I understand. You've come into some money to settle the lien. Smart. Though I have to ask, has anyone walked you through what it'll actually cost to make that structure livable? Because I have. We looked into buying it ourselves, more than once." "I heard," Mara said. "I heard my grandfather turned you down." "Twice." Something flickered behind Preston's easy smile. Not quite anger, something colder and more controlled. "Your grandfather," he said, "was a sentimental man, holding onto a piece of rock out of spite, long after it stopped making any practical sense. I'd hoped his granddaughter might be more reasonable." "I'm prepared to offer you considerably more than you just spent settling that lien. Enough to walk away and start fresh somewhere that isn't actively trying to fall into the ocean. I'm not selling." "Everyone says that the first week." Preston's smile didn't move, but something in his voice sharpened at the edges. "That structure has problems. Money alone won't fix fast enough. 21 days becomes 14 very quickly once an inspector starts finding things. I'd hate to see you spend everything you have proving a point to a dead man, only to lose the land anyway." He set a card on the counter, precise and unhurried. "The offer stands." "It won't stand forever." He left, with the bell over the door chiming behind him, and the diner exhaled as a room once the door swung shut. Bev came over and picked up his card between 2 fingers, like it might be contaminated, reading it before setting it face down. "Don't let that man's manners fool you," Bev said. "His family's been trying to own this whole stretch of coast for 3 generations, and Prestons don't take turning down for an answer well. You be careful." Mara pocketed the card anyway, not because she was tempted, but because some instinct told her it might matter later, a thread worth keeping, even if she didn't yet know what it was attached to. The inspector from Cedar Point came 2 days later, a wiry, sun-weathered woman named Carla, who moved through the tower with a flashlight and a clipboard, and the unhurried thoroughness of someone who'd seen every kind of structural failure the coast could produce. Mara trailed behind her, heart in her throat at every pause, every tap of a knuckle against stone, every long silence before Carla wrote something down. The verdict, when it came, was a mixed one. The tower itself was sound at its core. Good bones, Carla called it. Better construction than most of what got built along this coast today. But the lantern room's iron platform was rusted through in 2 places, dangerous enough to need full replacement before anyone should be climbing up there regularly, and the keeper's house needed a new roof before winter or the water damage already working through the walls would make the whole structure unsalvageable within a year or 2. "Ballpark," Carla said, capping her pen. "You're looking at 4,000 to 5,000 for the platform and roof both, done right. Less if you can source some of the labor yourself. I'll file that the structure's stabilizable, which is what stops the demolition clock. But stabilizable and stable aren't the same word. You've got real work ahead of you. $4,000 to $5,000. Mara had roughly $3,000 left after the lien and filing fee, plus whatever she could scrape together from diner wages that wouldn't come close to covering the gap in time. She thanked Carla, watched her drive off, and sat down hard on the porch steps, doing math that refused to work no matter how many times she ran it. It was Walt who found her there an hour later, having apparently walked up from the dock on some excuse she suspected he'd invented just to check on her. She told him everything: Preston's visit, the card still sitting in her pocket, the inspection numbers that didn't add up. Walt was quiet a long moment, looking out at the tower with an expression she was starting to recognize as him deciding how much to say. "There's things a man like me can't fix with money," he said finally, "on account of not having much of it myself. But there's things I can fix with hands and time, and knowing which of my neighbors owe me a favor or two." He nodded toward the tower. "That platform's rusted ironwork. I know a fella does metal fabrication 2 towns over, owes me from a debt older than you are. Roof simpler than people think, if you've got hands willing to learn and don't mind bad weather while you're learning it." "I can't ask you to." "Didn't ask you to ask," Walt said, standing, brushing off his trousers like the matter was settled. Elias would have done the same for any of us, back when he still could. Debts like that don't expire just because a man dies owing them forward instead of back. It wasn't $9,000. It wasn't a clean solution. But it was the first crack of real light Mara had seen since Carla's clipboard had turned $4,000 to $5,000 into a wall she couldn't see over. She was still sitting on the porch steps that evening, turning Preston's business card over in her fingers, watching the sky go the deep, bruised color that meant weather was coming in off the water, when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Tide's bringing in a system tonight. Bad one. You'll want to check that roof holds before you find out the hard way it doesn't. No name attached. No way to know if it was a neighbor's warning or something else entirely." And looking up at the darkening sky, she realized she was about to find out which, whether she was ready or not. The storm hit just after midnight, and it hit hard. Mara had spent the hours before dark doing everything she could think of, clearing gutters choked with 30 years of leaves and pine needles, hauling anything valuable up off the keeper's house floor in case water came through, wedging a tarp over the worst of the roof's weak spots, with rope and whatever nails she could find in the shed. It felt, the whole time, like bailing out a boat with a coffee cup. She kept thinking about the anonymous text, turning it over the same way she'd turned over Preston's card, unable to decide if it had been a kindness or a threat dressed up as one. By the time the wind really found its voice, there wasn't much left to do but sit in the kitchen with a flashlight and listen to the house groan around her. It groaned worse than she expected. The gusts came in long, building waves, each one rattling the windows in their frames. And somewhere around 1 in the morning, she heard a sound from directly above her that didn't belong to wind at all. A sharp crack, followed by a tearing groan, followed by water. Not a leak, a flood, sudden and violent, pouring through a gap that had opened in the ceiling above the back bedroom, exactly where her tarp patch had been fighting a battle it was always going to lose. She grabbed every bucket, pot, and container she owned and ran for the bedroom. And for a while, the storm and the leak and her own frantic bailing became the whole of her world, no room left for anything but the next bucket, the next trip to dump it, the next return, before the water found somewhere new to pool. It was during one of those trips, arms full, moving too fast across a floor gone slick with rain tracked in from outside, that her foot caught the edge of a warped floorboard, and she went down hard, wrist twisting under her as she tried to catch herself, pain lancing bright and immediate up through her arm. She lay there a moment on the wet floor, storm screaming outside, water still coming through the ceiling above her, and felt something close to despair reach up and take hold of her chest, for the first time since she'd stepped off the bus 3 weeks ago. Her wrist throbbed, swelling already visible in the flashlight's beam. The roof was failing. The money she had left wouldn't cover fixing it properly. And somewhere out there, a man in an expensive coat was waiting, patient as weather, for exactly this kind of night to prove his point for him. Everyone says that the first week. She thought about calling Preston's number off that card, just to hear what the offer actually was, she told herself. Just to have options. She was still lying on the wet floor, wrist cradled against her chest, phone in her other hand with his card propped against the flashlight, thumb hovering over the numbers, when her phone buzzed again. Not the same unknown number this time. Walt. Saw the front coming in on the radio. You all right up there? She stared at the message a long moment, rain hammering the roof above her, water still finding its way down through the widening crack, and something in her, stubborn and tired and furious at her own moment of weakness, made her put Preston's card face down on the floor and answer Walt instead. Roof's failing. Wrist might be broken. I'm okay. Scared. The reply came fast enough that she suspected he'd been awake and worried the whole night through, listening to the same wind she was. On my way. 15 minutes. Don't try to fix it yourself. Just keep the water off anything that matters. He made it in 12, soaked through before he'd even crossed the yard, and didn't waste time on questions. Just took one look at her wrist, wrapped it tight with a strip torn from a dry towel, and told her, in a voice that left no room for argument, to sit at the kitchen table and stay out of the way while he climbed up with a tarp and a staple gun, and did, in 20 minutes of grim, practiced work, what she'd spent hours failing to manage on her own. By the time the worst of the storm passed, somewhere past 3 in the morning, the leak had slowed to a manageable drip into a strategically placed bucket, and Walt sat across from her at the kitchen table, both of them wrapped in whatever dry blankets the house still had, saying nothing for a long while because there wasn't much left in either of them to say. I almost called him, Mara admitted finally, nodding at the card still face down on the floor where she'd dropped it. Preston. Tonight, when the ceiling came down, I had his number right there, and I almost— But you didn't, Walt said. Not a question, not quite forgiveness either, just a fact, laid flat on the table between them. I wanted to. For about 30 seconds I wanted to. More than I've wanted anything since I got here. That's not a sin. Wanting an easy way out at 3 in the morning, with your wrist swelling up and water pouring through your roof, Walt said. Sin would have been actually dialing it. You didn't. That's the part that matters. He looked at her a long moment, something unreadable in his weathered face. Elias had nights like this too, you know. More than a few, from what I remember. Man used to say, the Lighthouse tested everyone who ever tried to keep it. Not just the building, the person too. Said the ones who quit usually quit on a night exactly like this one. Storm and pain and an easy offer sitting right there in their pocket. He never told me that, Mara said. He never told me any of this. I only know him through a letter and half a burned logbook, and you. Then I guess, Walt said, standing slowly, joints protesting the hour and the cold. It falls to me to keep telling you, a little at a time, till you've got the whole of him. He paused at the door, looking back at her, wrist wrapped, blanket wrapped, exhausted, and still, somehow, sitting upright instead of giving up. You did good tonight, girl. Storm like that would have broken plenty of folks with a lot more resources than you've got. He left before dawn, promising to come back with the metal fabricator friend, once the weather cleared, to look at the lantern room platform. Mara sat alone at the kitchen table, as the storm finally wore itself out into a grey, dripping morning, her wrist aching, Preston's card still face down on the floor where she'd left it, and understood, with a clarity that felt earned rather than given, that she had just failed the first real test this place had put in front of her, and passed it anyway, by the thinnest possible margin. Her wrist healed slower than the roof did, which Mara found darkly funny in a way she didn't have the energy to explain to anyone. Walt's metal fabricator friend, a broad, quiet man named Oscar, who spoke maybe a dozen words the entire 2 days he spent up in the lantern room, replaced the rusted platform with something that looked, when he was done, sturdier than it had probably been even in her grandfather's day. Bev sent leftover pie home with her twice that week, unasked, tucked into a paper bag like it was nothing at all. Denise called once just to check the inspection paperwork had gone through clean. Slowly, without anyone announcing it, the town's watchfulness had started shifting into something that felt, cautiously, like being looked after. It was Walt who finally told her the rest of it, a week after the storm, sitting at her kitchen table with the salvaged logbook between them, and a folder of his own he'd brought from home, papers he'd apparently kept safe on Elias's instruction for longer than Mara had been alive. "Your grandfather didn't just buy this land quick and cheap because he had the cash ready," Walt said, sliding the folder across to her. "He knew something the Whitmores didn't, back when the Coast Guard was auctioning off the automated stations. This point was never a clean private sale to begin with. Old maritime provision goes back to the 1800s. Parcels attached to working light stations were granted to the acting keeper and his line, so long as the light kept being tended, one way or another. Most of that got buried in paperwork nobody bothered reading once lighthouses stopped needing live-in keepers. Your grandfather read it." "Whitmores never did, or never wanted to admit they had." Mara opened the folder. Inside, brittle with age but intact, was a copy of the original covenant. Dense legal language she had to read twice to follow, but the meaning underneath it was plain enough. The land wasn't simply Elias's to have sold to the highest bidder even if he'd wanted to. It belonged by old and still binding provision to whoever kept faith with the light. And every time Preston's grandfather had come sniffing around with an offer, Elias hadn't just been sentimental. He'd been standing on ground the Whitmores had no legal right to buy out from under him, no matter how much money they waived. "He blocked them because he could," Mara said slowly. "Not just because he wanted to." "Both, knowing him," Walt said. "But yes, legally, so long as somebody keeps faith with this place, lives here, tends it, doesn't abandon it, the Whitmores can push and threaten and make offers till they're blue in the face. They can't force a sale, never could." It reframed everything. Preston's practiced patience, his insistence that everyone eventually sold, the particular coldness that had flickered behind his smile when she'd said no. He'd known, or at least suspected, that his family's whole strategy had only ever worked on delay and discouragement, waiting for a wreck, too tired or too broke to keep fighting. She wondered, with a small unexpected pang, how many years, how many keepers before her grandfather had already worn down and given up before Elias finally didn't. There was one more thing in the folder, not legal paper this time, but a photograph, creased soft with handling. A young woman on the lighthouse steps, laughing at something outside the frame, dark hair whipping in the wind. On the back, in the same handwriting from the logbook, "Margaret, the day I told her about the covenant. She said I was building a life around a technicality. Maybe she was right. I built it anyway." "Margaret," Mara said. "That's your grandmother," Walt confirmed, gently. "She passed young, not long after your mother was born. I think losing her broke something open in Elias. He never fully closed back up, made him harder to reach, harder to forgive, even for his own daughter. I don't think the falling out between him and your mother was ever really about money or stubbornness, like family gossip probably had it. I think it was a man so afraid of losing anyone else that he kept everyone at arm's length instead, and called it strength. Mara sat with that a long time, the photograph in one hand, the covenant in the other. Two different kinds of inheritance, both of them finally making sense of a man she'd never met, but was starting, slowly, to understand anyway. The letter in the chest had told her the money was never the real gift. Now she understood the fuller shape of what he'd meant. He hadn't just been protecting a lighthouse. He'd been trying, in the only stubborn, sideways way he knew how, to make sure that whatever else got lost along the way, this one thing, this place, this promise, this chance, would still be standing for whoever came looking for it next. Preston Whitmore came back 3 days later, and this time Mara didn't wait for him to speak first. She met him on the porch steps with the covenant copy in hand and watched, with a satisfaction she wasn't proud of, but didn't regret either, as his easy salesman's smile faltered reading it. "This isn't going to end the way your family's used to things ending," she told him. He didn't argue the document. He didn't need to. She watched him understand, in real time, that the leverage he'd been counting on had never actually existed. "You'll regret this," he said instead, which felt less like a threat now, and more like a man reciting a line from a script that no longer fit the scene. "That structure will bleed you dry for years." "Maybe," Mara said, "but it'll be mine doing the bleeding, on my own terms, not yours." He left without another word, and this time she didn't feel the small, cold fear she had the first time he'd walked away. Just something calmer, steadier, closer to the quiet confidence Walt carried in his own hands. 6 days remained before the county's original deadline, though with the lien paid and inspection filed, the demolition threat itself was already behind her. What remained now was smaller, and somehow larger too, finishing the work, making the place not just legally safe, but actually, truly livable, for herself and for whatever came after her. The months that followed didn't move in a straight line. Nothing about rebuilding a place like this ever did. But they moved forward, which was more than Mara had let herself hope for on the day she'd stepped off that bus with $43 and a duffel bag. The roof held through the rest of that winter, patched properly now instead of held together with rope and stubbornness. Oscar came back twice more, teaching her enough about basic metalwork that she could handle small repairs herself, instead of calling in favors every time. Bev's pie deliveries turned into standing invitations to Sunday dinner, which turned, somewhere along the way, into Mara simply being someone the town counted as theirs, rather than a curiosity passing through. Even Denise, on one of her visits to check paperwork, had started calling her by her first name instead of the Lighthouse girl, which felt like its own small kind of homecoming. She kept the diner job through the spring, not because she needed to anymore. The last of the chest's money and careful budgeting had stretched further than she'd thought possible, but because Bev had become something like family, and family wasn't something Mara intended to be careless with twice in one lifetime. The lighthouse itself never went back into official service. The automated station out past the point still did the actual work of guiding ships, same as it had for 30 years. But Mara restored the old lamp anyway, over that first full year, piece by piece, more out of stubbornness and love than practicality. The first night she got the light turning again, weak and improvised as the mechanism was. She stood on the widow's walk in the cold and watched it sweep across black water, and thought about a man who'd done this same thing, alone, every night for 40 years, for ships he never got to meet. She understood him now in a way she hadn't when she'd first arrived. Not fully. Some of a person you only ever get in fragments, second-hand, through the people who loved them and the things they left behind. But enough. Enough to forgive him the parts of himself he'd never learned how to soften. enough to be grateful, without reservation, for the parts of himself he'd poured instead into this place, and eventually into her. Walt still came by most weeks, less out of obligation now than habit, the particular habit of two people who'd built something like family out of nothing more than proximity and stubbornness and one small brass key. He never did explain everything about her grandfather. Some things he still maintained, a person only gets to know a little at a time. But the gaps had closed enough, over that first year, that Mara stopped feeling like she was living in a stranger's inheritance and started feeling like she was simply living in her own home. It was late the following summer when a girl showed up at the base of the tower one afternoon, 16, maybe 17, with the same particular wariness Mara recognized from her own reflection a year earlier, the look of someone who'd learned young not to expect much from the world and had gotten good at needing very little. She said her name was Junie, said she'd heard around town about the girl who'd fixed up the old lighthouse from nothing, said she was aging out of the foster system in 2 years and didn't know yet what came after that, and had walked the whole way out here just to see, with her own eyes, that it was possible for someone like her to build something out of almost nothing. Mara looked at her for a long moment, at the too big jacket, the duffel bag she was clearly used to keeping close, the specific bracing posture of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment before it arrived, and felt something settle into place that had been waiting, she realized, for exactly this moment, since the day she'd first climbed those tower stairs herself. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put the kettle on, and I'll tell you the whole story, start to finish. It's a long one, but I think you especially ought to hear it." That evening, after Junie had gone, promising to come back, and meaning it, Mara could tell, she climbed the tower stairs one more time and stood in the lamp room as the light swept its slow circle out over darkening water, and thought about everything this place had taught her, that no classroom or foster placement or well-meaning stranger ever quite had, that worthless was just a word other people used for things they hadn't taken the time to understand. That inheritance wasn't only money or property, but the stubborn, quiet example of someone who refused to give up on something the whole world had already written off. That the hardest, most honest work, on a building or on yourself, was never really about the structure at all. It was about deciding, over and over, on the nights when it would be so much easier not to, that you were worth the effort of rebuilding. If there's one thing I hope you take from Mara's story, it's this. The thing everyone else has already decided is worthless might just be waiting for the one person stubborn enough to see it differently. Sometimes that person is you. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear which part stayed with you longest. Leave it in the comments below, and if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a new one waiting for you every week.